Good morning and welcome to Colonial Talk. Today is April 19th, 2022. I'm your host, Ethan Phillips. Today marks the 247th anniversary of the start of the American Revolution. We'll be talking about the tensions between the colonists and the British and how taxation without representation and the resulting alienation of the Americans led to the start of the American Revolution. Our American Revolution correspondent, Jimmy Turner, is here to take us back to the beginning and walk us through the years leading up to the revolution and how things deteriorated between the colonists and the British. Jimmy? Thanks, Ethan. Good morning. As you mentioned, tensions over taxation and the resulting alienation felt by the Americans led to the clash between the Americans and the British. However, this wasn't always the case. In the beginning, all seemed peaceful between the colonists and the British. According to SparkNotes.com, relations between the British and the colonists were amicable, and there was a mutual respect. The colonies relied on Great Britain for economic success and for protection from other nations who had interests in North America, while the British relied on the colonists for production of raw materials. However, in 1754, the British and the French went to war over control of the land in North America. Although Great Britain won the war, they were left with significant debt. To alleviate their debt, the British Parliament decided to increase taxes on the American colonists because the colonists had lower taxes compared to those living in Great Britain. According to Scott Miller's article, 10 Facts About the American Economy in the 18th Century, the American colonists had the highest income in the Western world and a tax rate of 1 to 1.5%. This tax rate was significantly lower than the 5 to 7% tax rate British citizens were paying in Great Britain. The British saw an opportunity to raise the American taxes and have the Americans help pay for the war, so they did it. The colonists, however, did not agree with an increase in their taxes. For one, they did not feel it was their responsibility to pay for a war that they did not want, and secondly, they were not given a voice in the British Parliament to vote on these taxes. This contrasting view regarding the right to tax without representation became the foundation of the colonists' anger towards Great Britain. This ultimately created a movement that triggered the American Revolution. It all began with the Stamp Act in 1764, which was the first direct tax on the colonists. According to the Stamp Act, all papers and official documents had to be printed on stamped paper produced in London and were subject to a tax. The sole purpose of this tax was to raise money for the British government. This tax angered the colonists and sparked organized opposition. Colonists began having town meetings and publicly voiced their frustrations regarding taxation without representation. The early colonial opposition pushed the British to repeal the Stamp Act 2 years later. However, the British were still determined to tax the colonists and imposed other taxes such as the Quartering Act and Townshend Acts, yet they did not give the Americans a voice in the British Parliament where the taxes were created. In response to these growing taxes, the colonists banded together and publicly discouraged the purchase of the British imports. One notable organization that formed in the opposition to the taxes was the Sons of Liberty. Our Sons of Liberty expert, George Pickens, who has spent many years researching this group and talking to descendants of members of the Sons of Liberty, will now share his findings. Over to you, George.
Thanks, Jimmy. Good morning. And yes, you mentioned I've spent many long hours researching the colonial anti-British movement against taxation and the formation of the famous group, the Sons of Liberty. Let's take a look. According to History.com, the Sons of Liberty were a grassroots group of instigators and provocateurs in colonial America who used an extreme form of civil disobedience, threats, and in some cases actual violence to intimidate loyalists and outrage the British government. The goal of the radicals was to push moderate colonial leaders into a confrontation with Great Britain. The most famous protest was in 1773, when the members of the Sons of Liberty dressed like American Indians and dumped 92,000 pounds of tea into the Boston Harbor. A local colonist documented the event for the local newspaper, the Boston Gazette. He said that the rage-filled act of treason was a noble sight to see, that occurs tea mingled with mud, and ever for to be, for king and prince shall know that we are free. The British responded by imposing the Coercive Acts to punish Massachusetts colonists. The colonists continued to feel alienated and frustrated with their lack of representation in the government. On September 5th, 1774, 12 of the 13 colonies sent representatives to Philadelphia to form the First Continental Congress, which urged Americans to boycott British goods and begin to form committees to enforce this ban. Unfortunately, by this point, it was clear that both sides were not able to compromise and the country was heading for war. Back to you in the studio, Ethan.
Thanks, Jimmy and George, for that great background information, helping us truly understand why the colonists were so angry and felt alienated by the British, leading to the American Revolution. To wrap it up, according to the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress, the American colonists felt that they had numerous rights that were being violated. It is evident that the British were not willing to recognize these demands from the colonists, and both sides were beginning to mobilize troops for battle. It wasn't much longer until the first shots of the American Revolution were fired. A few short months later, 247 years ago, on this date, April 19th, 1775. That's all for today. Hope you enjoyed our program on the anniversary of the start of the American Revolution, and will join us next week as we further examine some of the key battles during the Revolution. Thanks again for joining us, and wishing you a great rest of your day.